"That's delightful," Mrs. Silverman said, chortling. And Bob had to admit her contributions to the conversations were reasonably well informed. They sauntered from case to case, passing a tomb door and a statue of the jackal-headed Egyptian god Anubis. Mrs. Silverman laughed at his jokes and patted him sympathetically on the arm. All the while, the woman Bob really wanted was slipping further and further away. There was no harm in looking now. Mara was far enough away, and Saddle Shoes so engrossed with his new companion that she would escape notice. He was interesting looking, this man. Jeans, a bright red jacket, and a crew-neck sweater over a T-shirt, intelligent eyes, and young, well, younger than she. He and whoever this woman was were speaking with enough brio for Mara, and really everyone to hear. He was a little full of himself, maybe, but there was more in his head than just one lucky pickup line. His face, that heavy brow, looked a little pained. Yet he was listening to this odd lady, at least twice his age, and was even making a kind of effort to amuse her. Without knowing why precisely, Mara stopped. She stood in front of a 3,400-year-old Egyptian object the wall labeled called a mirror. It was a battered bronze disc now far too worn for reflection. She waited there, kneeling slightly, studying its details, as Saddle Shoes and Big Coat Lady engineer her. In a minute, they were beside her. Despite herself, Mara turned, straightened, and threaded a strand of hair behind her ear. Then she looked at him. "When you look in that mirror," she asked casually, "what do you see?" "I see a civilization that set great store by appearances." Mara was surprised by his tone. He was responding not like a man twice blown off, but as though Mara had been part of the conversation all along. She now saw that he had clear blue eyes, a dimpled chin, a head of wavy chestnut brown hair. Big Coat Lady was at his other elbow, looking at Mara cautiously, as if it were occurring to her that she had perhaps unfairly wrested this young man from his date. "Yes, precisely," Mara said. "The pharaohs and their mummies, if they wore that much makeup in death, you might imagine the fuss they made in life." "Egyptians pioneered cosmetics, didn't they?" said Saddle Shoes. "All that eyeliner, Cleopatra's baths, and milk and honey?" Mara stepped to the next display case. "Yes, and they fetishized youth in certain arrangements of facial bones. I don't know if in that sense their culture is much different from our own. You've seen Nefertiti?" "Haven't met her, but I've seen photos of the bust in magazines. A cover girl. By my light, she'd have as many admirers on Madison Avenue today as she did as the wife of Akhenaten." They entered a series of rooms of modern photographs. Man Ray, Walker Evans. Mara looked over her shoulder. Big Coat Lady was nowhere to be found. Thanks very much. Happy to answer questions and talk more about the book or where these couples wound up. Anybody? Yes.
I was struck by the chronology of what your parents did.
Yes.
Tell your father that I was in Manhattan and walking through Washington Square Park in 1966 on many occasions, and you could have been my son. I'd run around out there.
Okay.
Tell your father I'm sorry you got away.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, anyone else? Yes.
You met each of these couples.
Yes.
Individual spouses. How did you approach it? Did you say you're working on a book, or?
I was honest, yeah. I mean, I wanted to, most of these couples have a lot of pride in these stories, and there is something, and it's a kind of pride you don't see necessarily as much if. In couples who've met, say, online or who've met at work or whose friends set them up, not to make any commentary on the quality of their love for one another, but the story of how they met doesn't have this sort of cosmic aspect. And the stories the couples who did meet in these amazing ways would often have these rituals. They would go back to the place they met. They would watch movies that reminded them of the places they met. And so it wasn't that hard of a sell. The one place where I really was hoping to find a couple was the Brooklyn Bridge. I just thought it was such an iconic part of New York's landscape. And one of the ways that I searched for stories was just searching decades and decades of wedding announcements and newspaper clippings. And there was a marvelous story in the 1980s about a couple who found each other on the Brooklyn Bridge. They were the only two singles there. Everyone else was sort of coupled off or in groups. They had both brought their own bottle of champagne and were getting quietly drunk, as far as I could tell. And they found each other, and they hit it off. And the New York Post, I think, ran it on their front page. And so I went on Facebook, and I tracked them down by their names. And the husband, ex-husband, got back to me and said, it was a really beautiful story. Unfortunately, our marriage lasted all of 18 months. And I actually was willing to, I still wanted to put it in the book because I thought to have one story that ended in divorce would just add to the book's realism. When the ex-wife finally got back to me, she said, well, I'm remarried now. We met under far more ordinary circumstances, and it's lasted a lot longer. So, sorry. So the only time where I actually had someone who I really, really wanted in the book say no was when the relationship didn't turn out so well. Yes.
I assume that the people who you've written about have read the book, and has anyone said you didn't really get me right? I wouldn't have thought.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I do, as I disclose in the note on method at the beginning, I do allow myself to imagine dialogue based on, not on my own imagination, not just on fantasy, but based on what the couples told me they were likely to have spoken about. So if they said, well, I know we discussed the art, Bob Capell very distinctly recalled this pretentious line about, how Egyptians called their periods kingdoms instead of dynasties. I don't even know if he was right or not. But he recalled, so then based on what I knew of the couples and what the sort of subjects that they were likely to discuss, and what I knew of their voices, I allowed myself to recreate those things. And in none of the cases did they, in fact, one woman, Jean Lynch, who was a 19-year-old from Massachusetts who came with a group of girlfriends to New York City to buy bathing suits at Macy's in May of 1951, and who met Danny, a sailor boy, after she was running for the train in Grand Central Terminal, and she had of course overpacked. She had like 3 pairs of shoes for each day, and she had recently suffered a skiing accident. She had broken some of the bones in her palm, and so she's running to catch the midnight train out of Grand Central. She drops her bag and everything goes scattering across the platform, and she looks over and there's this, and all the sailors were sort of returning from Liberty, and one of them stops beside her to pick up her bag and sort of get her on a train before it leaves, and he winds up sitting next to her on the train. And they're married for something like 50 years until he passed away a few years ago. But in fact, she wrote me this very touching email afterwards and said, she said, I felt like you saw into my soul. I mean, and that was just, I clearly didn't know everything they said to each other, but it was gratifying to know that I'd gotten something essential about her right. And she wrote, one of the things that was really touching about this woman is just an astonishing woman. One of the things that struck me was just the pride, again, that they have in their stories. Not vanity, as much as this kind of abiding wonder about the unusual circumstances that brought them together. And after interviewing Jean Lynch at her home in Long Island, she and her son dropped me off at the Long Island Railroad Station for the train back to Manhattan. And I'd always wondered this question, was I intruding in some way? Because these are very intimate moments that you're talking about. I mean, we make a lot of mistakes when we're falling in love. It's embarrassing. But only 3 of the couples wanted to use pseudonyms. The rest used their real names, and I do disclose the couples that use pseudonyms. But Jean Lynch and her son dropped me off at the train station, and I remember her turning to me and saying, as I stepped out of the car, she said, "Thanks for making an old lady happy," which is just, it just broke my heart. And so I think that people do have this fondness and enjoy sharing them. And I think a lot of them, I don't think, again, did it out of vanity, but out of this sense that, as one of them put it, we just want to sort of put something beautiful in the world. And hopefully other couples will find inspiration in it, or will see their own love stories reflected in these stories. I know that when I was on the Leonard Lopate show 2 days ago, it was a fairly short interview, maybe 10, 15 minutes, but they apparently were just overwhelmed with emails of people writing in their own New York love stories. He read like 2 on the air. But this is not, it's impossible to encompass all the many ways in which people fall in love in the city. And one of my hopes is that people read this and sort of say, oh, I know someone who met this way, or maybe if I spend, if I open my eyes more and open my senses more in these public spaces and sort of let down my guard, there might be these remarkable moments where you can reach out to someone across lines of class, language. At least 3 of the stories involve immigrants who are here, and guess where immigrants spend time? New York is an expensive place to be indoors. So they're outside a lot. They're in Central Park. They're on the subways. And so at least 3 of the stories involve immigrants coming and finding someone who sort of becomes their guide to America. And in fact, that's my father's story in many ways. The Washington Square Park was sort of a pivot in his life, where he was probably very much after Yale, going to go back to Israel, and where his family was. But after finding my mom, there was no going back. And so, again, a public place that brings two people together and literally redirects their life in a significant way. Yes.
You seem to write like I don't know if it's personal opinion. It's, Night of Mysteries deep enough to know the feeling. So maybe it would be a second part just follow up one couple.
Yeah, well, one of the things that in the book, even though the stories end sort of at the point in which sort of the narrative tension runs out, where you sort of see them headed towards marriage, there are postscripts in the back where you catch up with each of the couples. You get to know where they are now, and not all of them. One of the interesting things is that again, the first story, the oldest story in the book, 1941, a dirt poor sailor from Texas, Willis Langford, is in the Navy. He's in New York City for all of 48 hours on liberty. He doesn't have a lot of money, so where do you go? You go to Central Park. That's where there's sort of entertainment. There's a lot of people to see. You don't have to spend a lot of money. And he sees a young woman who is attempting to light a cigarette. She's wayfish. She doesn't look like she's eaten in a long time. Her name is Joey Phillip. It turns out her father has recently died. Her mother has disowned her because she won't join a convent. Her mother thinks she's boy crazy, and she doesn't want to sort of do what her mom has told her to do. So she runs away from home in New Jersey. She's been sleeping on the subways. She's been sleeping in Central Park, and Willis Langford approaches her, offers to buy her dinner, takes her to a diner off of Park Avenue somewhere. And they wind up talking, and he winds up he offers her money for a room. He says, you shouldn't be sleeping on the streets. And she sort of takes it the wrong way, thinking like he wants to join her in the room. So instead, she says she sleeps in the park, and he sort of sleeps chastely beside her out in the open on the grass. They make this plan to meet the next day at the same time at the park, because he has to go back and check in at the receiving station on one of the piers in Manhattan. But then he gets shipping orders. He's shipped out to Philadelphia. And so he can't meet her at 6 p.m. the next day at the park, at the bench where they had first met. And he sends one of his sailor buddies out with a note saying, "Sorry, sweetheart, can't meet. It was great knowing you. Keep your chin up." She had confessed to him that she had attempted suicide a few days before, and it was sort of like this goodbye letter. "We had this nice night together. Keep your chin up. I hope things work out well for you." A couple weeks later, she gets picked up by the NYPD on charges of vagrancy because she's been sleeping in the park, and people have started to notice. And she's incarcerated at the Women's House of Detention. It was in I think it was in Greenwich Village at the time. And this enterprising feature reporter named Helen Worden from the New York Herald, the World Telegram, is looking for human interest stories. So she goes to the Women's House of Detention and sort of asks the warden, where do you have any great stories? And she's like, "Oh, you got to talk to the girl in cell B." And out comes this story from Joey that is really sort of a sob story about how her father died, and the only other person that had ever been nice to her in her life was this sailor Bill, who she'd met in the park, and even he's gone now. And Helen Worden was a tremendous writer, feature writer. And she writes this four hanky weepy about this poor abandoned girl. It was totally purple prose, but it was just an amazing story. And it was so amazing that it was carried on the wires, and it was reprinted in newspapers across the country, including the Philadelphia paper. And Willis, who's stationed in Philadelphia, picks up the paper, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, that's the girl who I bought dinner for 2 weeks ago." So he calls up Helen Worden and says, "I got to get back in touch with her." I mean, there's something too cosmic about all this, and he gets back in touch with her, and within a couple of months they marry, and this becomes kind of a cause célèbre. I mean, this sort of blew me away. It was the story, of course. Their marriage was again plastered all over the papers. She acquired the name Park Bench Cinderella. He was Prince Charming. The what do they call him? The Husky Tar from Texas, who picks her up in the park, and David Selznick, a movie producer back then, heard of the story and sent them like a 51-piece silver set for their wedding, and was thinking of making a movie starring Ginger Rogers. It never happened. And the New Yorker Hotel donated their bridal suite, and Benny Goodman struck up the band.